Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of HIUS at 597 1812, the original Forgotten War. Now, last week we looked over what the U.S. was like after the Constitution was written and ratified. Now, we specifically looked at stuff involving military policies, foreign policies, and how the U.S. was expanding at a great rate. Now, something I want you to make sure you remember when we discuss the things about this week is the political parties that formed during the early decades of the United States, specifically the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, on one side, you got the Federalists, which were in favor of a bigger federal government, a strong military, and closer relations to Great Britain. On the other side, you have the Jeffersonian Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, or just simply the Republicans, not to be confused with the Republican Party we have now. But the term is used interchangeably, so whichever term you end up using is fine in your research, just as long as you're consistent with what it is you're referring to. Now, the Jeffersonian Republicans were in favor of a smaller federal government and letting the states have more power. Now, they were not big into military spending. They preferred to have less of a federal budget, especially when it comes to the military, and they wanted closer ties to France, mostly because of the sentiment between the French Revolution and the formation of the French Republic, which at this time was no longer a republic. Now, as the nation continued to grow, it soon faced issues growing on the other side of the world. Now, specifically what I'm talking about is the Napoleonic Wars. By 1812, the Napoleonic Wars had ravaged around Europe, where Napoleon was dominating the entire continent, leaving Great Britain on its own across the English Channel. Now, as both nations duked it out for about the last 20 years or so, the Napoleon did not have a strong navy to come back to fight off the Royal Navy, and the Britain didn't have the army capable of fighting the vast Grand Armée of Napoleon. Now, it's important. Now, these are important things that you need to remember, especially as they relate to the U.S. To fight off Britain and to choke them out economically, Napoleon passed the Berlin-Milan decrees, which forbade any ship that was trading with Britain from coming into any ports that was part of the continental system, basically under Napoleon-occupied, controlled Europe. In retaliation, the Britain issued the Orders in Council, which targeted any neutral nation that was seeking to trade with continental Europe to choke out Napoleon economically as part of this British blockade system that was going on. Now, they weren't allowed to go to Britain per se, allowed to the continental Europe per se, but they still had to go to Britain, pay dues, trade stuff with Britain, and then they could go to Europe, which was still infringing on the neutral nation's rights to trade with whoever they want, which is where the Americans come in. By 1812, tensions between Britain and the United States were not great. They were getting worse. They were getting worse by the day, and it was even worse with the policies that Britain passed under its Order in Council. Not only were they infringing with the rights of neutral nations, which is what the Americans justified it as, Britain was also impressing American sailors. To simply put it, impressment was a practice Britain used for decades before the War of 1812, but the Americans still didn't like. They were taking sailors on American ships and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. Now, this is where we have some issues running on. A problematic issue that we have here is Britain was going specifically after people they deemed were British subjects, but people on the American ships identified as American citizens, and they could even obtain documentation to prove it. But back then, these documentations could easily be forgerized, so it's hard to tell who is actually a British subject or an American citizen. And this is the issue the very big issue that I'm bringing up is how do you define a citizen? Britain defined a citizen as you are a citizen of the nation you are born to. So if you were born in France, you were always a French citizen. If you were born in Britain, you were always a British citizen or a British subject, as it is commonly known. The Americans, however, especially after the American Revolution, believed that you could align yourself with any nation you choose to align with if you moved there, which is through a process of what they call naturalization. Especially since many of the high elite American leaders, especially men like President James Madison or even Thomas Jefferson, they were born as British subjects under the British colonies. But after the American Revolution, the Americans didn't want to identify as British subjects; they identified as Americans. And if you wanted to be American, you could come over here and be an American through a process of naturalization, which is something similar to what we have now. Now, this would be a very big problem because because the issue was just so fuzzy back then. They wouldn't know how to define a citizen, so they could say anybody was a British subject. Britain could say, "Oh, Johnny over there was a British subject," when he might actually have been someone born in Massachusetts. So it was very difficult to prove what citizen you were. So this is what gave Britain their justification for impressment. However, there were other issues glooming around on the American frontier as well. The British were arming Native Americans, which the Americans believed were just rumors and reports, but it was officially proven true after the Battle of Tippecanoe, when William Henry Harrison. That's a name you need to remember for later in this course, especially as we talk about the Native Americans. William Henry Harrison won the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, but after going to Prophetstown, the Native American settlement there, they discovered that the British were running guns to the Native Americans. All of these are things that you will learn about as you read the first two chapters of Bacon's book, The Weight of Vengeance. Remember to read the first two chapters of those. Now, the issue that comes up is the British were basically running guns to the Native Americans. It's one thing to arm resistance fighters, or the Native Americans in this case, against the American settlers, but it's another thing if they were doing it on American soil. They were doing this on the other side of the Canadian border, which at this time was not very defined. So they were arming the Native Americans to fight off the American settlers, raid their settlements, and kill anybody who was there. There were several massacres along the frontier, which angered the American people. The American people were angered after the Battle of Tippecanoe to the point where war was being demanded by the American people, specifically those who aligned themselves with the Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, when it came time to declaring war, both sides had merits and justifications for why they should and should not go to war. The Federalists didn't want to go to war. None of them wanted to go to war. As a matter of fact, when they voted for war, all of the Federalists in the government at the time voted no on the issue of declaring war. The reason for this was because they knew that the military was not ready. They knew very well the U.S. wasn't ready for war, and they wanted to have close ties with Great Britain. They saw Great Britain as people that they had what they had in common with. They relied greatly on the overseas trade with Great Britain to trade commercial goods. The Jeffersonian Republicans, on the other hand, favored a closer alliance with France. There was a serious anti-British sentiment going around among them, especially after the Battle of Tippecanoe. and the HMS Leopard and USS Chesapeake affair, which also comes back with the impressionist sailors, which you'll read about in Hickey's book this week. Now, these are some problematic people that you need to remember, which are mostly the war hawks of the Jeffersonian Republicans. A few people to remember are Madison, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay. Madison wasn't a war hawk in the same sense that John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay were. For those who don't know, the war hawks were the members of the Jeffersonian Republicans who were in great favor of war. Now, the issue with the reason these people were problematic is because they were pushing for war even though the U.S. was not ready for war. The army was very small and had only about 7,000 people spread out along the frontier. So they're not in one place, they're spread out. And the U.S. also did not have a navy. Most of the warships were even mothballed at this time and laid up, and were not ready to be fought. They had to be refitted and reorganized and decorated with weapons and cannons so they could go out on the seas and fight. Not to mention, Jeffersonian Republican policies had severe budget cuts when it came to military spending. So the military was far from ready to fight the war. The U.S. also, because of the disastrous embargoes that the Jeffersonian policies also put in, the Navy was seriously lacking in revenue. And so by the time, the reason they still went on with declaring war can be stated in the address from the U.S. Congress from June 1812, where it said, "From the review of the multitude replied wrongs of the British government since the commencement of the present war, it must be evident to the imperial world that the contest which is now forced on the United States, is radically a contest for their sovereignty and independence." So to the Jeffersonian Republicans, this was more than just a fight for American honor or American rights. This is what they believed to be a fight for the mere survival and independence of the American nation, which is why the War of 1812 has also been called the Second War of Independence. By the time we get to the end of this class, it will be up to you to decide whether or not that statement is actually accurate or not. Now, with all that being said, a question that is probably being asked is, how would they fight a war if they weren't prepared for it? That is what we will be getting into next week when we talk about the early campaigns of 1812, specifically along the western frontier along the Canadian border. Now, I want you to remember that you have two assignments this week, your political debate and your British Empire discussion. The instruction for them are on canvas. For the political debate, we will be meeting later this week. We will be meeting later this week. We will meet over Teams, and we will have the debate. I think it'll be great, and it'll be a great way for you to understand the different viewpoints of the political parties and why declaring war came so close as it did, as you will read in your readings this week. And your readings are in Bickham, The Way to Vengeance, and Hickey's The War of 1812, A Forgotten Conflict, a book you will be needing severely throughout this course. Now I hope you all have a great week, and I hope and pray that it is a blessed week for you guys. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. My door is always open. Thank you.